Saying that they were all referred, they were. Oh, I gotta mute this.
East of one line.
And they were under the elector Palatine, I think, at the time. But an awful lot, I mean, surprising to me how many came from those areas. And it raises another problem of actually tracing where people live because of all the changes that Mike is describing. They're often, sort of the protocol in genealogy is you use the present jurisdiction, the country, the county, et cetera, et cetera. But that's changed an awful lot, so it can be, it adds a difficulty trying to figure out where the immigrants who came here, or specifically where they came from.
And one other detail there, they also came from east western line. This is Lorraine, province of Lorraine in France, okay, and Lorraine and Alsace were also heavily populated by German people. There were French people there, there were German people there, and one other little footnote, were all of these people that are going to jump on a raft or a boat and go down the Rhine on their voyage to America. There were also French Protestants who were driven out of France. They were refugees. They settled in the cities along the Rhine, and in particular in Mannheim, the Huguenots, and they are among the population that goes down the Rhine with the quote Palatines, and they were considered Palatines by the English just because they were mixed in that population. They spoke German because they had assimilated. But they also spoke French. They were aware of their heritage, but just to let you know, it was not a homogeneous movement. There were a lot of other elements in that population that came to this country, and so in this area, when you hear the name of Cal, or you hear the name of Lagarde, you're running into that other heritage.
Or Demery is another one.
Demery, you're right. They were members eventually of New Jerusalem Church.
Well, they came, as most of them by the time they came here were German speaking.
Right.
Even though the origin was French. You see this much heavier in Frederick County, Maryland, where there were actually clusters of French, but who were German speaking. Jenny will correct me if I misspeak on this. Go ahead.
Okay. Next one.
Okay, we made some progress. We're getting somewhere.
Okay. The goal of going down the Rhine, okay, and to cross the Atlantic was Pennsylvania. And the reason Pennsylvania was such a great place to go to at that time was a lot of advertising by William Penn himself. William Penn had acquired the territory by bailing out Charles II. Charles II had incurred a lot of debts, and William Penn bailed him out, and in return, Charles granted him this huge territory in North America. And Penn was a Quaker. He had been arrested as a Quaker because Quakers were dissenters of the Church of England. He had been in prison several times, but nevertheless, he had money. And and also a certain amount of prestige. His dad was an admiral. So anyways, William Penn had this territory, and of course, it was back in the 1600s, it was pretty much empty. I mean, it was an empty territory. And so what Penn wanted to do is populate it, because without a population, you'll lose it. And so he recruited in Germany. He sent agents through Germany. He himself toured through Germany, and with glowing reports of what a wonderful place this is. And that seemed to work because of the misery that was in Germany, especially in the Palatinate, with incurring wars from basically from the end of the 30 Years' War, 1648 through 1790. It was there was one war after the other, and the poor Palatines were beset by armies coming in, ravaging. Yes.
This is on your point.
Yeah, yeah. And so one of the impulses to immigrate, avoid military obligation, because the young men would be pulled into these armies. There was devastation from the 30 Years' War. There was the severe winter of 1708, 1709, which caused a lot of starvation, and there was religious persecution. And that was not, even the Lutherans and the Reformed were there were three recognized churches in Germany. Okay, the Lutherans, the Reformed, which were Calvinist, and the Catholic Church. Everybody else was a sect, and they were not tolerated. In fact, if you were a Baptist, what they called Anabaptist, in other words, if you did not baptize your children at birth, but waited for them to be adults to decide to be baptized, okay, you were an Anabaptist. Or if you said you wanted to be rebaptized in your Christianity, that was against the law to the point of incurring death penalty. And so the sect people, the Amish, the Mennonites, the Schenkfelders, the Dunkers, all of those little groups were persecuted in the Palatine. So, and one other trick to that, and that was that if your ruler was a Lutheran, okay, then you were a Lutheran. You were taxed by the Lutheran Church. You were a Lutheran. If that ruler died and his brother came into the power, or his uncle or somebody, and they were Catholic, then all of a sudden you had to change your religion again. And that was the law. That was one of the agreements out of the Reformation, the Augsburg Confession. It's your religion was your rule.
And the Peace of Westphalia.
Yeah, the Peace of Westphalia.
One other thing I would say which has a lot of bearing on the experience in the colonies, was the property relations. Because much of this area, unless you were the nobility, and almost everybody else were serfs, just a step above slavery. They were considered owned by the lord, the prince of the duchy, or whatever it was at the time. Some places did have property rights and inheritance rights, but when the Germans came here, this memory stuck with them. The fact that they were not able to own land, that they were basically captive, they were tied to the land and tied to the prince. And in fact, if you were to leave, you had to pay a fee, and you actually had to undergo manumission. The term that we use here for enslaved people, for blacks, was used there to free the serfs. So this affected them when they came here, including in the German settlement here, because it was a big issue during the Revolution that they were not able actually to own, or in most cases even lease property. Because you had Tankerville and you had Fairfax, and they were the lords of the manor. So the urge to actually be able to own property is very important, because that's how you provide for your family in a continuing way. And you enjoy the fruit of your own labor. So, and even a place that I was reading recently about Free's Rebellion in Pennsylvania, which was north of Northampton County, which is not where most of our people here came from, who came from Lancaster and York counties. But there, the division between, that Mike was referring to, between the church people, they call it the Kirchenleute, the church people, and the sects, the Zechtenleute, was very sharp, and it really been exacerbated during the Revolution, because most of the sects were pacifists and didn't participate, whereas the Lutherans and the Reformed, the church people did. So after the Revolution, when certain things began to happen with taxing property, this evoked the memory of what had happened in Europe when they couldn't have land. They got here, they owned land, and they feared it was going to be taken away from them. So these relations that Mike is describing, I mean, they may seem kind of abstract, but those were very real in the memory of the people who were here, and it affected how they reacted to developments here, including during the Revolution.
I'll give you an example of what Ed was talking about by the manumission here.
This is good.
This is a quote from 1742. We, Wolfgang Ernst, Count of Isenburg and Budlingen, etc., herewith make known, in response to a petition by our subject Johannes Reber from Isenburg, we graciously deign to grant to Johannes and his family freedom from personal bondage on us and our house, to graciously allow to leave here and remove to Pennsylvania. To the before mentioned humble petition also, we graciously granted in mercy, without reservation by us or our house, to Johannes, unhindered passage to other places. Should he settle in the future again in our lands at a place where personal bondage is the custom, in which case he shall again be returned and remain in bondage, irrespective of this grant. Attested by our Privy Committal seal, Bernstein, the 23rd of April, 1742.
Part two.
So what I'm going to talk about is at this point, is the founding. How old is New Jerusalem? When was it founded? This is something about which you've got legends, you've got a few facts. You've got a lot more legend than fact, which is true on an awful lot of things concerning this kind of history. The date that's thrown out everywhere is 1765. Now, some people who work with me on research and things like that, Taylor, for example, I can get pretty stubborn sometimes.
Okay.
When either politely it's called drilling down, or it's called going down rabbit holes. But I just pursue this, and I'm going to take you a little bit down my rabbit hole on this, of how I tried to find out where this date came from. Working backwards, you getting it?
No.
Okay, so,
Oh dear.
no, okay. Okay, this is the standard history of New Jerusalem. It was the first of a series written by Pastor Mike Gretchen, who was quite a historian. and put a big emphasis on knowing the history of the church and the community, and the nation, as you'll see. This was the first booklet that he put out. Oh, okay, I'm sorry. I'm looking at the next one. In 1965, which was the 200th anniversary of New Jerusalem. And this, if you get the newsletter and look at the website, the 1765 date always says that the church was, a log church was built, and then a school, a burial ground, and so forth. We, of course, have no pictures of what that looked like at the time, but I searched around for some that might look like it. And this is the 1806 pretty famous log church in Bedford, or Shellingsburg, Pennsylvania, Bedford County. Bedford County is an area where a lot of people from here went. The German settlers went after the Revolution. And that's sort of, you could sort of imagine this as being the old cemetery, because the log church was facing from the road, the far right corner of that cemetery. So it would have looked something like this. Now, 10 years later, after Pastor Ketchner's first history, he did this, which is you can't see it, but it's actually a thick volume, about 1.5 inches, 2 inches thick, of mimeograph pages, as they did in those days, as we did in those days, I should say. And this was the people of God and their country. And so he wrote this, a chapter on the church, a chapter on what was happening in the nation throughout history. Very interesting. Now, he cites as his source, and he uses the 1765 date. One of them is Dr. Eisenberg's History of the Lutheran Church in Virginia. Is Bill George here? Okay. Dr. Eisenberg, I think it's an uncle or cousin of Bill George. And what Dr. Eisenberg says is that he describes New Jerusalem as the second Lutheran congregation east of the Blue Ridge, because most of the others were in the Shenandoah Valley, of course. The Palatines from the Hudson River dispersion, that was the original Palatine settlements in the colonies, came to this area around 1792. His source, then we'll look at each source that was coming in there, was The History of Loudoun County by James Head, which is written in 1908. But that describes the movement of the Pennsylvania Germans into Loudoun County. But again, nothing specific on the church. The earliest reference that I found going back in history books, the various histories, right, at the time I was looking at it, was Dr. Wentz. This is Dr. A.R. Wentz. He was the sort of leading church historian, scholar at Gettysburg Seminary. And in 1920, he published a book called The Centennial History of the Maryland Synod, and we were part of that Maryland Synod. So it had, in addition to a general history, a page or two on each particular congregation. Now, what he describes here is again the 1765 date, but then he goes back to John Casper Stover. This is Stover Sr., who was, among other things, I mean, Pastor Stover was in Pennsylvania. In fact, he baptized some of my ancestors around the area around Lidditz. And he went down and served the first Lutheran congregation in Virginia, which was in the Germanic settlement, and it's the Hebrew Lutheran Church. So he describes in his chapter, which was actually written by Pastor Meyer from here, that in 1732, the Reverend John Casper Stover, who was pastor at the Hebrew Church in Madison County, Virginia, and that Stover, in an article he published called the Lutheran Church in Virginia, states that he had visited the congregation and the German settlers in the locality of Lovettsville. And that this crystallized into the New Jerusalem Church. That, I think, was the first reference I saw on this, which was a couple of years ago. When I tried digging deeper into it now, as to where did this come from? I mean, people, today's scholars kill you with footnotes, right? I mean, half of the pages of a book could be footnotes and references. They didn't do that in the old days, for better and for worse. So it makes the reading easier, but it sometimes makes trying to find the documentation harder. I went to, a few weeks ago, to Gettysburg Seminary, to the archives there, to look at Dr. Wentz's papers. They have boxes and boxes of important papers. And this is a draft of that section that I showed you, right? That ended up published on 2 pages in the book. It's a handwritten draft, and I suspect what it was is that the draft was written by Pastor Myers, who was at New Jerusalem at the time, 1920. And then Dr. Wentz went through, and you can see some red scratches out and interpolations and so on. I suspect that was Dr. Wentz. I would have to spend more time with the reference to figure that out. Like here, and let me find the particular quote that I wanted on this. Well, I'll get there. So these are the notes. No need to spend a lot of time on it. I just had fun doing it, so I'm sure you can have as much fun looking at that as I did the originals. In trying to track down the similar language, this was the Pennsylvania German, which was a magazine that came out in a 1908 edition, had an article by our very own Bristol Goodhart, who was, I mean, well known to many of you as the chronicler of the Loudon Rangers. He was enlisted in Loudon Rangers when 15 years old. This is why he's still writing stuff at the turn of the century and after, because he was very young at that time. This is an article in the Pennsylvania Germans in Loudon County, Virginia, in the Pennsylvania German magazine. He says here about the 60 families, and I personally consider this in the category of more of mythology, but there were 60 families who came here as a group in 1734. But it's clear that there were people did, I believe, come here at that time. And he says that the first minutes and records of the Lutheran Church of Lovettsville were destroyed when the church was burned. The only fire we're aware of is the post-Civil War fire in 1868. But the main register of the church survived intact, and that's what we use every day, is using copies of that. So it may be the case that there were other records that were in the church at that time that burned. But everybody says that the earliest records of New Jerusalem are 1765. And we have not found those yet. And I'm counting on Mike with his skills of reading ancient German to find something that probably in the records of Evangelical Lutheran of Frederick that would indicate what Schwertfeger was here and what he did at the time. There's certainly nothing at New Jerusalem of an original records going back that far. The register was begun in 1784 after the Revolution. But he what again is interesting in what he says is that he says this is Goodhart. The first authentic record of the organization of New Jerusalem Lutheran Church is dated 1765, but it's quite probable the church was organized earlier. This is very very close to the language that Dr. Wentz used as well. And then Goodhart describes Casper Stover in more detail than the other accounts, which, now we've had a problem on this too, because I found a translation of Caspar Sober's record. It was published in Hanover, Germany in 1737. And at the German part I found, to the extent I could, it seemed to correspond to the English. Mike looked at it. But I'm pretty convinced there's another version of that report out there somewhere, because Goodhart says that he visited the congregations in the German settlements in Prince William County. Now this was Prince William County at that time. Winchester, Woodstock, Strasburg, and Fredericksburg. So he's pretty specific on that. And it was, of course, common in those days that since the original of any document was handwritten, the copies were made and various things, and eventually it ended up being printed, but that what was printed does not necessarily mean it's the original. So we're going to keep looking for that. So we have Goodhart. Now, something else I dug out, which I had seen, probably 10 years ago when we were doing the 250th of New Jerusalem, was a document that was probably in the church records, but not part of the official register. There were a lot, frequently loose papers will be stuck into them. And this says, there's a note here which you won't be able to read. You see the handwritten note. But that's by Xenophon Richardson, who was the pastor at New Jerusalem during the Civil War. He says that this document is a sketch. It's from and it was printed. What you see, the printed part was printed in a paper called the Southern Lutheran, probably around the 1870s. But the handwritten note says the above is from a sketch by Reverend Dr. Howard, found in the old church book. And he says, extending to the Christmas of 1839. So Dr. Howard wrote this before 1839. And then he says that he himself, Pastor Richardson, Xenophon Richardson, updated this thing up till 1872. But what is interesting on this is that this is the earliest record we have from the church concerning the history. And let me see if I can best do this. The congregation was organized in the year 1765 and starts out soon after that obtained a grant from Lord Fairfax. And then, well, so that's where it gets, he does not actually talk about the Stover visit earlier, but this is in terms of the 1765 date. This is the earlier we have, and I think that's pretty credible because if you think about it, he comes here in 1832, right? Dr. Howard. Now, after a real period of catastrophe in New Jerusalem, it wasn't even called New Jerusalem at the time, in that church, over the language question. They lost, minus 90% of the members were lost because Pastor Zapf did not want to do anything in English. And young people wanted to do English, so they went elsewhere, including, I think, the Rehoboth Methodist Church. But anyway, when Howard came here, there still would have been people in the church who were here in 1765. Right? That's people in their 60s or 70s. So he would have heard from them, or their parents were here. But he would have been in a good position to say when the congregation was founded. That would have been something that people would remember. So in terms of that date, until Mike finds something else, this will be our best evidence on this. Now, but then we go back, we still have this 1734 date, which is Caspar Stover's document saying that he visited here. And of course, many other reports saying that that's when the first group of the Germans, organized group, came here. Now, I have a picture here of the Reformed Church. That's this congregation, but one that was out in the cemetery, the Reformed Cemetery, just right outside of town. Because in looking through the history of this, which I was doing a couple of years ago when I did an article, which is on our website on the Religious Freedom Ball. The archivist at Evangelical Reformed in Frederick, Jenny Russell, raise your hand, Jenny, so.
Retired.
Retired, and she was the archivist, so she graciously let me into their archives room, and I was looking there for any records concerning this congregation here, because as with New Jerusalem, you know, any early history is found in Frederick, not here. And there was an article then by Reverend Lampy, who was here in 1901, which is when this church was built. This is a long article. It's published in the Brunswick newspaper at the time. Nobody would read this today. I mean, you look on the screen, you're good. If you watch it for 20 seconds, you know, that's a big attention span. This was a long article, very small type, on the history of this congregation, now called St. James. But he says our Reformed congregation, with their sister, the Lutheran, was organizing the first year of the incoming immigration, which he's talking about 1734. So here's the Reformed pastor saying the Lutheran congregation was established at the same time as this one. And that they met in homes for many decades, with the first church building being 1765 for the Lutherans and 1775 for the Reformed. Now, I mean, that makes a lot of sense, and I never quite bought this idea that the Reformed came here, you know, in the 1730s, and the Lutherans came here in 1765, because that's not the way it worked in Pennsylvania, where they all came from. The Lutherans, and they were pretty much one church body in Pennsylvania, and as we talked about earlier, you had the church people and the sect people. And the church people were Lutherans and Reformed, and they usually use the same building. And they, you know, you go back and any family's baptismal records from that period, for the early, say, post, when the records started being kept here, they'll have kids baptized in both churches. It just depended where there was a pastor at the time, because they all came until 1830, they all came from Frederick, and they might have been here once a month. So there was not a sharp division. I don't think it makes sense that there was some sharp division back when they came here. They would have come together, and they probably, it's functioned there, I would guess, as a union congregation, meeting in homes. And if somebody came through, Dr. Schlatter, who was the Reformed pastor who came here in 1748, describes meeting with Elder Wenner. Any Lutherans who were here probably just mixed into the crowd, right? So I think we're looking at a situation which is, of course, lost in the fog of history, not just fog of war, but the history of these things in that period. Very hard to pin things down, but they were looking at a situation pretty much with these two churches, which were the only ones here, grew up together. Now, I want to go on to the religious freedom side of things. How are we doing time-wise? Yeah, okay. I don't think too many people falling asleep yet, so if you want to go ahead. During we were talking about, you know, back and forth earlier here. During the Revolution, this was a time of really profound change within here. Now, I was looking back at what I'd written about Xenophon Richardson and the Civil War, and that's a lot more disruptive because but there's many parallels to it. Any period of war is a period of disruption. It's a period of demoralization, particularly for those who have to fight the wars. And the church leaders write about this all the time. If they lost members, people who've been in war come back with a different attitude. You know, as we all know, frequently they don't even want to talk about it. Right? It's not something you go around and brag about. And it has a profound psychological effect, and on the population as well. So you get, it's a real social upheaval. It occurs among families, in domains of religion, economics, and everything else. And here we know, for example, I mean, they may have been peaceful family farmers up to the point of the revolution. And most of them, I mean, they came here from Pennsylvania. Even though they were squatters, they were squatters who were tolerated and encouraged by the lords, lords of the manor, Lord Fairfax and Lord Tankerville, because they needed the land to be improved. Or you could lose it if your land wasn't improved. The Germans were very good at agriculture and improving the land and making it go over it. So that was to their benefit. And they, for the most part, they didn't even seem to care that they had leases or not, if they were here. But of course, those farmers had no legal protection. And during the war, this became a very big issue. We had a talk here last year about the tenants revolt in Loudoun County. And it was a slightly different situation in the central part of the county that Anne Marie Lason was talking about. But everybody was faced with if you paid rent, a quit rent or a ground rent to your landlord, you generally paid in crops or in goods, because hard cash specie was hard to come by. And that was impossible to come by during the war. Remember, the markets were cut off. And so farmers who depended on selling things, it was an impossible situation. That's what led to the tenants revolt. There was a little participation from you, but not that much. But here we know that Tankerville sent his land agents out to try and start to collect some rents, which they hadn't done for a long time. And they were just seizing people's property, seizing personal property. They couldn't seize the land because it was theirs already. But the personal property, including farm equipment, household equipment, livestock, crops, grain, seizing this and selling it in lieu of debts. And then there was a big counter reaction going into the courts from the settlers, both the Germans and the Quakers. In fact, the Germans with the help of the Quakers to do that. But this is the kind of effect that the revolution had. Now, one of the major impacts, which we can see quite clearly, is the Virginia Religious Freedom Law. Now, as Mike indicated, the German churches were in a little different situation than those that were called dissenting churches. For the most part, in Virginia and other colonies, the dissenting churches, the Baptists, Methodists, Presbyterians to some extent, Quakers, were considered dissenters from the Church of England and were not legal. And in many cases, and even in Virginia, you could be dunked within an ounce of your life, an inch of your life. You could be jailed for doing that. Ministers were not the only ministers who could baptism and conduct baptisms and marriages were the Church of England. Now, it was a little different with, and we often wondered how the Lutheran Reformed churches here, function. Well, one, they functioned with pastors from Frederick, from Maryland. But secondly, they were just out of the way that no one paid much attention. But the fact that they were, as Mike said, that they were recognized churches in Germany, they were established churches, so they were in a different category than what's called dissenting churches. A couple indications of this. When Stover and some people from Madison County here, the Germanic wanted to go back to Europe to raise some money, Governor Gooch gave them a letter of reference and introduction to the crown, right? It was Queen Anne at the time, and then her successors, giving them, vouching for them. So that's not the way you treat a dissenting or an illegal church, right? The Muhlenberg case is really interesting, and this I realized when I looked at this about a year ago, it was a lot, in terms of the religious freedom, more complex than I thought. You hear, well, he was a Lutheran and he had to be practiced as a Lutheran in Virginia. He had to go to London and get ordained as an Anglican. What actually happened was that the Anglican Church asked for a Lutheran minister to be sent to the Shenandoah Valley because they had a shortage of Anglican priests. And this was Colonel James Wood. Yeah, from wherever we had these SAR events, you know, the Colonel James Wood, the second chapter from Winchester, who's there. He was the best, James Wood Jr., the second, was the vestryman in the Anglican Church. And he went to Pennsylvania to meet with Henry Muhlenberg and say, can you send us somebody who can serve both the Anglican and the Lutheran congregations in the valley? Which again is not the way you would treat a dissenting church, right? And Papa Muhlenberg says, well, my son's kind of a restless guy. Maybe this would be good for him. Maybe this will help him settle down. This is the one that became a general, right? But he was a rebel as a youth. That's another story. So he goes and gets ordained as an Anglican, already ordained as a Lutheran, as an Anglican pastor. And then it has churches of both types in the valley before the revolution. So that's the situation. And then when I originally wrote about, you know, the title of my article, I think was, you know, were the churches here legal? Were they legal? Because they were not the Anglican Church was the established church. But nonetheless, even though they may have been tolerated or allowed to function, it's significant that the religious freedom law in Virginia, which was a model for the rest of the colonies become states, right? Was first introduced in the General Assembly of Virginia in 1779, and it's finally passed in 1786. Now, if you look at New Jerusalem's history, and it's parallel to the church here too, St. James, they were always dependent on Frederick, the Frederick churches, the Reformed and the Lutheran churches there, for their ministers, up until about 1830, you know, long after this. But they were not really freestanding churches. New Jerusalem adopts its constitution. It becomes, you know, basically a freestanding independent church as of 86. Same time as same year as the religious freedom law. It starts keeping its own records 2 years before that. The Reformed Church here, St. James, starts its own record books in 1789, and it's about that time that it becomes an independent congregation. So the churches, I mean, it's two steps. One, that the Lutherans and the Reformed both were dependent on their, what they called the fathers in Europe, you know, particularly here, the fathers at Halle, they call them, where Muhlenberg came from. That got cut off during the revolution, so that the churches as a whole became independent and standing on their own 2 feet in the new United States. But then within that, the individual congregations also became independent as a result of the revolution. And that's a big part of the evolution of these two churches. Now, the other area Mike we want to talk about is this will be the last section. I will try and keep this brief. Is I call it assimilation and Americanization, which takes the churches up into well into the 19th century. One more.
Well, I'd like to, go back to Pastor Miltonberg, which I quoted earlier, and his impressions of Pennsylvania, which are and about religious freedom. Okay, and he writes, the preachers throughout Pennsylvania have no power to punish anyone or to compel anyone to go to church, nor has anyone a right to dictate to the other, because they are not supported by any consistory. Many preachers are hired by the year, like cowherds in Germany, and if one does not preach to their liking. He must expect to be served with a notice that his services will no longer be required. It is therefore very difficult to be a conscientious preacher. He goes on to say, liberty in Pennsylvania is more hurtful than useful. There is a saying that in that country, Pennsylvania is the heaven of the farmers, the paradise of the mechanics, and the hell of the officials and preachers. And that sort of underlines the transition of the churches. The German churches were state supported; they were part of the state. Here in Pennsylvania and in the colonies, they were, other than the Church of England, they were on their own, so to speak. And
Well, they were, some cases they were actually underground.
yeah, or underground. But that was a Lutheran pastor in the 1740s. There was another moral dilemma which I've uncovered, and that is that well, there's an example. First of all, the first pastor here at New Jerusalem was Johann Samuel Schwertfeger, and he was educated in Erlangen, which is it's just a little north of Nuremberg in Germany. And he, as a young man, he decided he was going to America. He fell a victim to the redemptioners who were recruiting young people to come to America. And so he arrived in Philadelphia around in the 1750s. Of course, he had no money, so he was sold, literally. Well, for his good fortune was he was sold to the First Lutheran Church of York, Pennsylvania, who needed someone to teach, and since he was university trained, he was ideal for that. He eventually appealed to Henry Muhlenberg to be ordained. He was ordained, and at that time he was in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Eventually coming to Frederick, to the Evangelical Church in Maryland. Yeah, so that's the 1765 Bible at New Jerusalem Church. Another story. Well, he was at New Jerusalem for basically about 2 years, and he disappeared. By the way, he was itinerant, so his charge was evangelical in Frederick. The church here in Loudoun County, Woodsboro, and Freegertown.
But still,
Yeah. Anyway, so he did the circuits, but he established the congregation here in the German settlement. Well, he disappeared, and he had told Henry Muhlenberg that he was going back to Germany, but Muhlenberg never notified the congregations, and so when he showed up again, Pastor Schwertfeger thought, well, I'm going to resume my charge. Well, the Maryland congregations, especially evangelical, didn't like that. They suggested he find another place, and Muhlenberg was at pains to find places. He finally ended up at a congregation just outside of Albany, New York, in the 1770s. and just in time for the revolution. Well, a good conservative Lutheran, okay, pastor, what does he do? He admonishes his parishioners in accordance with Romans chapter 13. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, he who resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment, and on and on. Yeah. So that is the dilemma that he had. Well, for his stance and some of his parishioners, he was thrown into prison several times up there by the Patriots, and fortunately they didn't harm him any, but he was suspect. After the revolution, a lot of his parishioners went up to Canada. He stayed there for, I think, another 2 years in around the Albany area, and then we got a call from Upper Canada to come up and be a pastor there. He is known to this day, and you can find signs on locations in the villages along the St. Lawrence River as the Saint of the St. Lawrence. Okay, he is listed as a hero of the United Empire Loyalists, and he spent the rest of his life up there. But his dilemma was the Bible, and those who are familiar with Lutheran, we have the secular and the heavenly kingdoms, two realms, and he was caught in the middle. So that was Pastor Schwer.
Yeah, I think we're gonna need to wrap up. Let me make one, get the last word in here. This also affected the Muhlenberg family, because Papa Muhlenberg, again, being older, was very upset about the revolution. He was very upset with his son Peter, because Peter had gone to Holland. The three brothers went to Holland to be educated. Peter ran away. He was apprenticed out to a druggist or something. Didn't like it, ran away, got on the British troop ship, joined the British regiment, came back to the colonies. So that's how he got his military inclination, and later became one of George Washington's generals in the Revolutionary War. He and his brothers also had big arguments. This correspondence is still out there today. Now, over whether they should participate in the revolution. That does not seem to have been an issue here. Right? That they were farther removed, and certainly here, we've looked in more depth at New Jerusalem because of the records. But you had, got 33 patriots of the Revolutionary War to be doing the monument, dedicating a monument, hopefully within a month or two. For either for military or patriotic service, civil service in support of the revolution. I don't doubt that it was the same situation here. We just haven't found anybody who wants to do the research on that. But the German settlement was known in all the histories as being very patriotic during the revolution. And I haven't heard of anybody who were expressed loyalists or Tories, although they probably were here. So that was part of the situation here. I think we should stop now. People have questions. Some of our topics we need to get to, we can work my way into those through the questions. Rich.
Couple things real quickly. Thank you both for all that research and sharing with us, because that clarifies a lot of the situation of emigration, the coming of the revolution, and the change that will come with that. Reminder, our next meeting is in 2 months on the 11th of January, and it will be our annual meeting to which you are invited. We hope you will join the Historical Society. We do have membership, which you can see on our website. Finally, you have questions, no doubt. What I would suggest is, because we've gone a bit, if you need to speak out, please do. But secondarily, some of the best stuff that comes during our lectures is right. So we hope you can stay. Please do. Does anyone have a question?
There's the one Mike brought over some displays from New Jerusalem, which were made for 2 weeks ago for the 260th anniversary. So those are over in the fellowship hall next door.
So you may want to go over there. And see this stuff. Yeah, cool. Who's got a question?
Why are these churches here at this location? My sense is the Germans that came here were much more dispersed around, and that this wasn't necessarily a central location.
Precisely because it wasn't central, I think, is how they ended up here. I mean, this is sort of the edge of what was called Greater Pennsylvania.
This is at the edge of it, right?
The vast majority of the Germans in pre-revolutionary war period, the 18th century, came into Pennsylvania, and they went west and then took us, as one of our speakers called it years ago, the big left turn, down to the Shenandoah Valley, going through Maryland. Some of them sort of stopped here, so why go further? But the bulk of it went into the valley, which is still to this day by some people called Greater Pennsylvania, right? Very high count, Shenandoah Valley, Shenandoah County, I think, formerly Dunmore County. Highest concentration, I think, is there of Pennsylvania Dutch or Pennsylvania Germans. So they were farmers, the ones that came here. Some had stills, but the bulk of them were farmers. And the thing was in here, unlike in Europe, if you found a big tract of land that wasn't settled, and here they just settled it, they just squatted and they started farming it. And you could actually, in 2 or 3 generations, you could become fairly prosperous, which you couldn't do. In Maryland, they were able to own land. They were able to buy land and they moved in. Here they weren't. But because it was out of the way, they wanted to farm. They wanted to farm, and essentially were happy to be left alone and be able to do that. They had their church, they had their church school. You know, it was before there was a lot of commerce. That really didn't come into this area until the railroad and the canal came through in around 1830. But if that's your question, why did they come to an out of the way place like this? I think it's because it was out of the way. Does that make sense?
And in terms of, we got New Jerusalem got a land grant from Lord Fairfax for the land that we're on, so how did that factor in why we're where we are?
Well, in terms of the specific, Fairfax was, I mean, he was well regarded, you know, as someone who was a British lord in this area, and he did support the churches, and he gave land grants for churches, and he did that both for these two, and it said that it was, I've got maps here that we don't have one now. New Jerusalem was given 12 acres of land to be used for a church, a school, a burial ground. And as long as it's used for that, you know, they can keep it. If it ever stops being used, you have to come back to Fairfax. Well, that was actually a court issue in the 1950s because they wanted to sell part of it. But Fairfax gave them that. He provided that to them. And the other church, the other Anglican churches, all of them. I don't know. Not that it's, I'm not sure about Baptists. But that was part of the way it operated. So that, and as I said at the very beginning, those were the central, if not the only institutions here that existed. And I don't know.
Well, that could be an incentive for being here.
Well, that was done after they came in.
Particular piece of property, start to look at a map and look at how far is it to Short Hill? And how far is it to the Quaker settlement? You had East Ascatockegan Creek, Old Creek, is Quakers. How far is it to the south, Richards Creek? And you look at that little box, what's smack dab in the middle, where these two churches will be built. It's central, as you said.
But and also keep in mind that Nottingham County was settled, the rest of the county by settlers coming up from the Tidewater area. They were coming from the south and the east. So this area was pretty much a no man's land at the time. They hadn't gotten this far, except for along the river, where there was some fishing commerce and ferries later and so forth. But it was sort of wide open territory. And they were able to come here and as I said, they were essentially squatters, but squatters that were not only tolerated, but encouraged to farm and develop the land and so forth.
Do we have other questions? Yes.
Towards the beginning of your presentation, you talked about the churches being people forming churches first, and they were responsible initially for care of the poor. I heard you right.
That was talking about the established church. That was the Anglican church, the Church of England.
But then it sounded like the community came later. The church first, then the community. One of these said.
Well, they came, I think they really came at the same time. We've said that wherever the Germans went, the churches were established very quickly. The Anglican Church of England was wherever the settlers from England came, that grew up. So they sort of followed the population move. I think the population moved first and then the churches came in.
But the village of Lovettsville, later the town of Lovettsville, does come a bit later. Most of these things are gonna come after the revolution, and there's usually a really practical reason. Who's gonna build a store, or who's gonna build a mill?
And where?
And here, that comes later. There's no creek here, so there's no mill here. There's mills to the west, mills to the east and to the south. But, if you see that it goes right down the street, 1836, gives you a hint when Lovettsville comes to be. One other thing to think about it. President Jackson, 29 to 37, so he's 1830s, bringing in a new idea. Victor, go the spoils. If you had been a Democrat and you supported him, what's the number one spoil he can give to the Podo? Running a post office. And suddenly we had more post offices in Loudon and every other county than you could shake a stick at. You start looking around here, we had 2 post offices over where I live in Taylorstown, a mile apart. Obviously a post office, if it really makes good, will have a store, and if that makes good, then somebody will build a livery stable, or a road will come, or whatever. But again, the 1830s is the great boom. It's coming a little earlier, but that really explodes right then for real practical reasons. But our churches belong here, not the buildings, but the congregation. Other questions? If you do have a question and you think of it as you stand up, these gentlemen are going to be here for a bit, and at the very least, taking apart all this audio visual wisdom. So please feel free to talk to them. Thank you very much for coming today. We hope that your upcoming holidays are great. There will be an Veterans Day ceremony here at the town of Lovettsville on the Squircle, which will be November 11th, of course, which is 2 days from today. One other thing that I would mention, there's a great history of German peoples. Keep in mind what November 9th is, right? And for those of you who need a hint, 1938, or if you like to go another hint, 1923, Munich. Today's the anniversary, 102nd anniversary of the beer called Putsch, which is why 15 years later, with the Third Reich in power, you're going to see the infamous Kristallnacht, the great pogrom. And that is a day in German history, November 9th, that goes back even before the beer hall Putsch. November 11th, St. Martin's Day, traditionally, right about that time, is the beginning of the Christmas season. And you will notice weirdly that around here, all of a sudden, people start to decorate. Some people realize, I can't do it on Tuesday. And the delivery cheesesteaks, Willows just down the street, all decorated for Christmas. That is the German influence and tradition. And of course, it is Armistice Day, the end of the Great World War. So 11 o'clock, if that interests you, please come. Feel free, whether you're from Lovettsville or wherever. Thank you all. Thank you. Ed.